to Raise Daniel's podcast. I'm your host, Joel Smith, and today we have a very special guest, Miss Koko Widsom, who serves with the Pioneer USA Mission Organization in Orlando, Florida. Welcome, Miss Koko.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with you. I appreciate you inviting me.
Well, I'm so excited that you get to be on this show today. So briefly, do you mind telling our audience what you do?
Absolutely. So I work with Pioneers, and we are a mission sending organization. We have about 3,500 missionaries all over the world. And some of our core values would be reaching unreached people. So some of the people with the hardest access to the gospel. And we do that through church planting. We do that through working on teams. And we're very innovative and flexible. So if you're looking for an organization like that, come our way. You'll find us online. It's really easy to just do a start form, put your name and email, and somebody will get back to you. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. My family served in Southeast Asia for 11 years. And we moved back to the States about 4 years ago. And now I serve on what we call the member development team, where we serve the missionaries on the field by just giving them all the resources and support they need to really thrive. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Very cool. Well, so I got to hear your story, or at least part of your story, on a podcast called Relentless, which is put out by Pioneer USA. And you told a story, and I'm going to just briefly highlight it, and then you can go back and fill in all the holes that I left. But ultimately, you knew at age 8 you wanted to be a missionary. You were a great singer, pretty cool. You went to college, you got married, you had the direction of a country that you're going to get to go to. All your dreams are coming true the way you planned it out. You even spent a little time in the country that you're about to go to, and then you got some really bad news. And interestingly, on the bad news, it seems like as believers, we tend to look down the road and say, okay, God, I see where you're leading. You know, I'm heading that way. I'm excited. There's hope. There's a future. And then the bridge between here and there gets blown up. And you're like, okay, God, what are you doing? And so your bridge basically got blown up. Maybe there was some shrapnel and you could still kind of navigate a little bit, but your bridge was blown up. But then you have a really cool story, and then that leads us to where I want to go. But why don't you go back and fill in all my holes, because I know there's a lot.
Oh, you're a great listener. It sounds like you picked up a lot from that. Yeah. So I was pretty far along with my second pregnancy. We had just gotten back from our survey trip looking at the country where we wanted to serve. We were just on fire. My husband had only 1 year left of seminary training, and we were already raising support, and I was having ongoing problems with my voice. We just assumed it was something normal like laryngitis, and nothing. It was not responding to treatment. And as that course unfolded, discovered that I had had a catastrophic vocal cord injury, so the top 1/3 of my vocal cords could not touch. And that was a huge devastation to me, because it led to, basically, the doctor said, this is not going to heal over the course of your life. We don't know how long. Eventually, you will need to use a computer to speak. And there's really nothing we can do except try to help you put less stress on your voice. So I went to some speech therapy and kind of relearned how to speak as best I could. But over the next 10 years, it really limited my capacity and what I was able to do. And as I shared on the Relentless Pursuit podcast, one of the biggest challenges was figuring out, well, should we even go to the field then? Because I'm not really going to be able to have much to offer. And as we processed that with our mentors and thought about it more, we just realized, well, it's not going to be any better in the US. Like, if there's no, treatment that I have anyway, and there's nothing that's going to make this better, why not spend my life doing what I feel called to do? And really ended up supporting my husband and providing a real stable foundation for the family from our home there in Southeast Asia, from which he was able to go out and do a lot of those things that we had felt called to do, with church planting and mostly serving and supporting local pastors there and training them. So that's the story. And I don't know if I want to give away the spoiler alert that was not the final end of my story.
Well, what's so cool? So you mentioned a couple things. One, that basically you had to make a decision. Do I want to use my voice? Because every time I use my voice, it's like a cup that's being poured out.
Yeah.
And you said, if my kids run out in the road, do I yell? Because that's going to take a big chunk of what's left of my voice. I'm supposed to
Mhm.
homeschool, I'm supposed to serve God, and yet I have no voice.
Mhm.
Uh, so, uh, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, I think I said the phrase that I always say is like I was spending currency that was going to run out. So every time I was asked to do something, I had to think about, is this going to be the last of my voice, and that was the threat just was so big to me. And there were certain things that hurt a lot more than other things, and no one could explain why that was, but I could not read books aloud to my children at all. Anytime I was in a really noisy environment, it was extremely stressful, and I think it just made me tense up more, so the pain was more. So I was just in chronic pain all the time, and so I was having to manage that at all times. So if I was gonna do something, it was gonna hurt. So am I gonna do that, or am I gonna stay home and not do that? And it was just really a lot on my husband as well, obviously, because we had to homeschool there. There was not a school available. So I had to adjust the entire way that we even did homeschool. So the kids really ended up having to take a lot on themselves and learning how to kind of teach themselves because I wasn't really able to use my voice that much. So yeah, it was, and I think that image of the woman who had the pot of oil and she just poured it at Jesus' feet, that was like my treasure at that time. That was the picture that I kept going back to. And what Jesus said when she poured out that oil at his feet, one of the disciples said, don't do that. And he was mad that she was wasting this money. And Jesus said, she has done what she can do. And it was that phrase that came back to me over and over. That was my sense of just like my calling in that time was as much as I could do that was all I could do. But what I could offer was to just like lay it all at his feet. And if I get to that point where I don't have a voice anymore, then I will know, I have done what I could do.
That's very inspiring. So the cool thing is that obviously you're talking to me today, and obviously now you have a speaking role. So something incredible must have happened. Can you enlighten us on phase two of the
Yeah.
blown up bridge?
Yes. So it was about 10 years really where it just continued in the same way where I wasn't able to sing, I wasn't able to speak from the front. I was having to do a lot more of like home-based ministering, quieter, one-on-one kind of discipleship, which was not really what I felt called to originally, but it was a blessing, I think, in some ways. But about 10 years into it, we were coming back. We call this home assignment. So that's when you come back to the States for a short time to visit all your supporting churches, and it's never a restful time. People always think, "Oh, why are you going on this long vacation?" But it is actually not restful at all. It's very exhausting to go out, and especially when I had to struggle with my voice and know when I could speak or not speak. But one of our supporters is a child otolaryngologist. So he worked with kids with any problems around their voice and around like breathing and speaking. And so he said, I really think it's a wise thing to go ahead and get a checkup because it's been 10 years since we looked at your vocal cords. So he found, like through his contacts at medical school, the top quality doctor on my route and scheduled me an appointment there. And I was so nervous. My husband and my supporters said, you can't go alone because I had gone by myself when I first got the initial diagnosis, which was I almost fainted in the doctor's office when they gave me the initial diagnosis. They brought a counselor in, and because it's so devastating, it's a really devastating diagnosis. And they said, you will like not have your voice for the rest of your life and need to use a computer. So they bring a doctor in. They bring a counselor with the doctor at that time. So they knew I had that trauma of receiving that news. They were like, let's have your husband with you. So my friends took care of our kids. Our kids were older at this time, and my husband came with me, and I got so scared because they had my results from the original diagnosis, and then they had the new one, which they used the same machine, and they were side by side. And when they came to talk to me about it, they brought all these doctors in the room. So it was triggering that initial like, oh no, they're going to tell me something really bad. But what they were doing was they wanted to show everybody something that is very rare, which is that I actually regrew my vocal cords. So they said, 10 years ago, this technology where we could see what was wrong with your vocal cords was kind of new because they would send sound waves into your vocal cords and you're not making noise, but they can watch them and replay them with digital like technology and watch them in slow motion so they could see that the top third was not touching. And so when they brought in, they had the new panel with my vocal cords, and you could still see the scar. It was just on the side. And now there's all this new tissue, and everything that's touching was brand new vocal cords. And they, of course, I don't know, maybe it was a miracle, maybe God just did it, but they
Praise
said
the
in
Lord.
rare
Yeah.
occasions, people are able to regrow their vocal cords. We thought this was a permanent, condition at that time, but now we know that some people can recover from this injury. And so I was like, well, why does it still hurt? And they were like, because you're using your throat muscles to push your vocal cords together, which is what you had to do with this injury. But so now we need to send you back to speech therapy again and relearn how to speak. And so they sent me to speech therapy, and it was the people that do like celebrities. So there was like James Earl Jones on the wall and like Celine Dion's face because
Wow.
that was their clients. And
Yes.
here I am just like, some missionary from Southeast Asia, and, they're teaching me. And I was, by the end of about a month of doing that, I relearned how to speak without pain. And so
Wow.
all the time, I don't know how long they were okay, but I knew now. And that from that point was when it was like being born again, to be honest with you, because it was like thinking my whole future, I'm just going to have to live with this and figure out how to make an okay life for myself. But now, oh my gosh, I can dream. I can do the things that I have felt called to do. And so I went back to seminary that very next semester, and I took 5 years. I did a very slow master's because I had kids at home. But it was a real pleasure, and I had so much joy in it because it had been taken away. To have it restored, I think I just had that gratitude that I knew that it was a privilege, to be able
Wow.
to study.
And another spoiler alert, now you're working on your PhD in spirituality and suffering, which it's like, whoa,
Mhm.
that's pretty intriguing. Um, but so basically for 10 years, we'll say that you kind of lived in darkness in the sense
Mhm.
that there's a ticking clock and it will expire and my time is up. And you came to the
Mhm.
conclusion, you know what? I'm just going to pour out what I have. And when it's gone, it's gone. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It means a lot that you would
Yeah.
cry about that because it was deeply difficult
Yeah.
to go through that.
I can't imagine. So obviously now you're utilized to help other missionaries who are going through different levels of suffering.
Mhm.
And so I'm just curious, you mentioned a number of things, practices that you found,
Mm.
people that you've seen. And so, in our, we got about 15 minutes. What could you share us in a nutshell with tools? And even if there's a tool that someone's like, hey, I'm going to look deeper into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you mentioned, I think one of the things that I learned was that lament is scary. It's scary to feel sadness when we don't know if it's ever going to go away anymore. And so for me to sit in that place of God, even some of the Psalms when he talks about I cry out to you, I'm like, but I want to cry out and I can't cry out. So even like sometimes reading that would provoke more of the loss and more of the sadness. Yet I think that there is something really cool that can happen with lament where you think of it like lament being like grief and like pouring out your loss, but the fact that God put that in the scripture shows us that he's inviting us into a dialogue with himself in our pain. And so that is an idea that I got from Walter Brueggemann, who I also mentioned in that podcast. He has some books out about this topic. He's a theologian and a pastor, and just that idea that God welcoming us to cry out to him and modeling that in the Psalms shows us that it's okay to say these really deep, crushing, painful losses in his presence, and to know that there's an interest on his part to be welcomed into that, and to think of that of lamenting in his presence as a dialogue with God of saying, I don't know why you're doing this, and yet I will still praise you. And that's what you see, that there's always a turn in the Psalms where the psalmist, yeah, he's really, really honest. And then at the end, he comes up and he says, yet I will hope again, yet I will praise you. And so I did develop a practice that we do with our missionaries at Pioneers called praying the Psalms. And this is a practice that I learned in my master's program because I was studying the Reformation era spirituality and realized that through that time, all the different strands of our faith were praying through the Psalms as they faced their grief and losses. And during the Reformation, there was still plagues going on, and so they were still dealing with things like we've had with COVID, like loss of loved ones, like confusion over, what is happening in our society and broad scale losses like that. And they would use the Psalms and they would pray together corporately and individually, utilizing the Psalms. And so what we have done is we've developed a practice, and you can do this at home. It's really easy. You can do it with one verse, you can do it with an entire chapter, and you just take a little chunk of that psalm and you read it and you just see what comes up in your heart, and you kind of just journal your response. You're not trying to reword the psalm in your own words. You're just trying to see what emotions are evoked in the presence of God through scripture, which is God's word to us, and then using that as kind of a launching pad to talk to God about where you're at today. And that's something that I think can be really helpful to our missionaries because they're in very remote locations. They go through a lot. They always have their Bible with them. They don't need any special extra things, but they can just allow those to come up. And you have to think of these negative emotions like beach balls that, they're filled, and we push them down and they keep coming back up in our faces and we keep pushing them down. But if you just let it come up and you just show it to God and you're like, this is really hard, God. This is really, guess what? It doesn't last forever. Even me, even with my voice, even with that loss, I was still able to experience joy. I was still able to have deep relationships. And that's because as you just kind of allow those difficult emotions to emerge with God, they don't last forever. They do kind of move into a space of joy, just like when the psalmist, when he says his difficulties, but then at the end he says, yet I will praise you. That's what the human soul, God made us with that capacity to feel joy, even as that sorrow is kind of released in his presence.
So, one thing I'd like for you to touch on, if you don't mind, is so my goal is to equip parents to raise modern day Daniels and Daniellas. And let's face it, we live in a fallen world. We're
Mhm.
surrounded by suffering. It is all around us. And so, as you as a parent go through suffering, and as you mentioned, Psalms or some of these heroes of the faith that you've studied in the past, your kids had a front row seat at what's going on. Can you think of anything that helped them as you endured suffering to build a skill that could help them as one day they will endure suffering as well?
Absolutely. I think as a parent, there's just such a strong desire to protect our children from suffering. And I think that's good. I think that comes from a place of love. But I think also in American culture, we actually have a lot of power to protect our children from suffering because of the way the infrastructures that are available to us. But I think that also can lead to them not having as much resilience if we are protecting them from everything. They don't have that inner resilience to know that they can trust God themselves when they go through something. And so one of the analogies that we talk about is like the trees, which there was this biodome in Arizona, the biodome 2, where they were kind of testing out different environments to grow plants and vegetables and trees. And everything was going great, but they realized as the trees were growing up really tall, then they would all collapse and they couldn't figure out why. And it was because there was no wind inside of the biodome, and the trees actually need wind in order to develop strength in the trunk to take on like the natural processes of nature. And that's what I think about with my kids is it's not like I want to let them just be completely blown over, but I do want them to experience a little bit of adversity with me in my home while I am there to help them through it. So my husband and I, we think about our home as both a safe haven and a launching pad. So we want our kids as they're out in the world to know that they can come home to us, that we are here, that we will always be with them, that we will always protect them, that we will be a safe haven. But we also want them to feel empowered to go out and to try new things and do things, knowing that they can always come back and receive comfort from us if it doesn't go well. And so that's kind of the way that we think about like the paradigm that we hold, especially now as we are parenting teenagers. And our first has just gone off to college. And so we're kind of beginning to see, really thanking ourselves that we've been doing it this way for about the last 8 years as our first one was moving into becoming a teenager. We actually did something called a manhood and womanhood journey. So it was a 1 year process for each of our children from the age of 12 to 13, where we discipled them very intentionally one on one. So me with my daughter and my husband's with our sons. And we actually just developed our own curriculum because we couldn't really find anything that felt like it really worked for us. But we would give them about 8 units of ideas of these are people, these are exemplars of the faith. So for my daughter, it was Deborah, it was Ruth, it was, Mary and Martha, like women that she could kind of look at. They're not perfect. Of course, no human being is perfect, but we could even talk about in their imperfections, like what did we notice there? And to try to cast an imagination for her forward of the kind of woman that she wanted to become. And through that, we also developed in the middle, we would have a challenging experience. So something where they would really encounter one of their deepest fears. So we would work with them of what do you think would be something you would want to try. So my sons, one of them did like a ropes course because he had some fear of heights. One of them did surfing because he had a fear of the ocean. And one of them did like a camping overnight in the woods and some kayaking and whitewater rafting. And so part of that is to have that like with me. I was with my daughter doing that really hard thing and we were together and we were having fun, but we were pushing the boundary of what felt safe to her because we want to like grow that container that she has for resilience so that when hard things come and she's not with us, she will have like a stronger container that won't be completely bowled over by the weight of the world that comes her way. And then at the very end of the 1 year process, we have an evening. It's like a ceremony where we bring all the women or all the men into their lives. So for my daughter, all the women that were part of her life came. There were people even that flew in from out of state for one of our kids' ceremonies. And we have a whole night where we celebrate them and everybody writes them a long letter about what womanhood or manhood is. And it's just like you were saying, I love your vision for Daniel and Daniela because in my opinion, we live much more in Babylon than in Jerusalem. And so
Yes.
I think just acknowledging this is the reality of what we are facing now, but kids are so resilient. God has made people through human history to go through so much atrocity. Christian brothers and sisters, I know we feel scared of that in America because we haven't been through a lot in the last 40 or 50 years. But as a society, as far as like world wars and like really major experiences of loss, so we've had a lot of protection. So I think we're really scared of suffering. But I just want to remind ourselves that throughout history, God's people have been through so much, and yet it's never stopped him, from really taking care of his people and building his church. There's always been a presence of God's people in the world. So I think in my opinion, we don't have to be afraid of it. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world, and our enemy has already ultimately been defeated. We don't have to stand in terror of him, but we do need to stand up and we need to face the reality of what this society is like for our kids so that we can equip them.
So ultimately, a biblical foundation with practical activities, typically addressing their fear or a tension zone of what would you not want to do that we can make fun and grow.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so fun to just imagine and be curious with your child. And,
Okay.
you know, imagine just creating, I feel like a place where we want to move is into the imagination right now because we're kind of locked into some things in American in evangelicalism that I think can be really difficult for children, especially gender identity issues and sexuality. So that is so scary and big for us as parents, and we need to face that absolutely. And we also want to have fun and be curious, with them, and absolutely biblical foundations. I mean, that is always there, doing family devotions, like praying together, all those basics. But
Yes.
I really feel like, in my opinion, the best thing we did as parents was to, right at that age of 12 to 13, to be like, you are a man of God in this world. You are a gift. What can that look like? And moving into a positive space of imagination so that they could begin to explore that with us still in the home has been just an incredible blessing. All three of our kids have gone through it. And as a family, we all feel like it was one of the most powerful things that we had experienced together. And it really helped my husband and I to begin to loosen our grasp a little bit and allow them to start trying things like take on leadership roles at school, or doing big stuff like
Sure.
doing volunteering, things that I wouldn't have probably like thought of for them, but they dreamed of it and they pursued it. And we could say, hey, yeah, let's do that. Like, we support you. We'll be your safe haven and your launching pad through that.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate it. One last thing before we wrap it up. So mom hacks, missionary mom hacks. You I guess you were raised in the North where it was cold. You live in Florida. You like the hot. You cook with noodles and chicken. That actually sounded really good. I'd like that recipe. But what are some mom hacks?
Well, I mean, I think this is like so silly, but we would travel like we traveled all over the world with our kids. And I was always stressed out about like where all my stuff was. Like, we have to make sure we have all the passports and all the children and all the luggage. But
All
I
the
would always,
children.
yes,
That's important.
critical things, the passports, the
Yes.
children. But I would always have this throwaway bag of food because I don't know about you, but it feels like people are always giving you food while you're traveling, and then there's food. But I didn't want to put it in my luggage because then it could the orange could get crushed and then all the
Yes.
juice get on my stuff. So I'd always have like a little grocery bag full of just random food. And then if I forgot, I didn't even have to think about it. If I forgot it somewhere, it was fine.
Cool.
Someone else would discover it and get rid of it.
Yes.
But we would be in a lot of places where there was no food available, especially during Ramadan. So I always needed to have like a bag with enough food up for like an entire meal for our
Wow.
family whenever we were like traveling away from home. So
Okay.
that's one of the things that I did. And I told you that I used to always, and I still do, I have one little packet of the Via Espresso in my purse at all times so that if I get too tired, I can just throw it in I don't even put water in it, nothing. I just put it right under my tongue and I just wake up because it's really hard when you have jet lag and you're traveling like 36 hours with your kids sometimes. So that's another
Espresso
thing.
shots without the liquid. Well, I really appreciate your
Mm.
time. I really appreciate your insight. And thank you so much for being part of this inaugural podcast. And I look forward to seeing what God does in your life. And thank you for standing in the gap for the faith.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you're doing here. It's so important, Joel.
Well, praise the Lord. Wow. Thank you so much for listening to this season of Dare to Raise Daniels. It has been an incredible experience, and my prayer is that it was a blessing for you as well. If you're like me and you're like, oh man, it's over, I'm going to continue to roll the tape because we have a recipe from Miss Koko Wisdom as well. So now tell me, you said your kids love the soy noodle chicken recipe. My kids like chicken noodles.
Well,
And
you know what you can do? You can
yes,
get like ramen
yes,
packets
yep. I have a daughter that loves ramen.
and make like I don't know how big is your family?
We have 10 kids, and
What?
yeah, we have 10 kids, and they're all
Oh my
ours.
gosh.
And yes, we know how that happens. And yes, we have a TV,
That's
and
awesome. I
yeah,
love that.
yeah,
That's really
20,
interesting.
21 all the way down to 5.
Well, no wonder you're so passionate about this topic.
Yeah, yeah.
That's so cool.
Well, I still
Well,
remember. I was just gonna say
mhm.
real quick. I still remember I wasn't married. I was doing some ministry work, and this guy asked me. He's like, "So, are you planning to get married and have a family?" And I actually said, and this is, not too long ago. I'm like, "Yeah, the world is just so messed up, and I don't know that I want to bring kids into the world." And all he
Mhm.
said is, "Think about Moses's parents." And I was
That's
like,
a really good
"Oh,
point. Oh my
whoops."
gosh.
And he's
People
like,
say that to me all the time. I'm like, you just need to read a little bit about church history and you're gonna feel
"Yes."
like this is the best era we've ever been in,
We've
guys.
been in a cush time, yes, and it's
Yeah,
hard because I
I
liked
know.
my cush time.
I
It was
know.
kind of fun going to the cafeteria after church on Sundays and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I got you off
Mm.
track. Ramen bag.
Oh, well, for your family, you're gonna need a lot more than I was gonna suggest. But yeah, I would do like one, like the little boxes of ramen that
Yes.
like, just the plain chicken flavor or
Sure,
whatever. I would
sure.
get probably like 8 of those for a meal for
Okay,
your family. Maybe 10, depends on how
okay,
hungry your older kids are. And then throw in like 5 chopped up cooked chicken breasts
okay,
and then a bag of spinach.
okay.
And then add a bunch of salt and then maybe add some chicken broth powder, like test the
Sure,
flavors. Like you
sure.
might need to punch it up with a little bit more chicken broth
Yeah,
powder. You might need to add some more salt like to offset, but that'll taste a lot like what I was talking about.
okay. Now you said that it had some sort of soy or a mild sweet soy
That
flavor
would be
to it?
like a soy sauce, like
Okay.
soy
Yeah,
sauce. Like
just put the soy on top.
you could have that in the middle. You could use that instead of salt. That would really be nice. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Cool.